It's Game Boy World, and this is a malpractice suit waiting to happen. Back when Game Boy launched, it seemed like we couldn't get away from Mario's ubiquitous face. Not only did he get his own eponymous role in launch hit Super Mario Land, he also cameoed in a host of other titles, including baseball and Tetris. Since the system's debut though, Mario has kept a low profile. Nintendo trotted him out to put him in stereotypical ethnic costumes for a conversion of Taito's Quicks, but other than that, he's been more or less missing in action. And now we know why. He was off getting a medical degree. Now, I'm not exactly sure what kind of med school allows you to graduate in just a year, but the sketchy haste of Mario's education certainly would go a long way toward explaining his questionable medical practices here. Dr. Mario is what I guess you'd call a prescriptivist, which is to say his solution to illness is to prescribe medicine. A murderous torrent of medicine. Mario's objective here is to clear away a horde of viruses by slamming them with pills of a like color. The viruses appear in 3 colors, and so do the pills that destroy them. So, a red virus can only be destroyed by lining it up with 3 red pills, or, curiously, by enough pills to link it to another red virus. Basically, you're trying to line up 4 red objects in a row. Well, that was the case in the NES and PlayChoice 10 versions of Dr. Mario. On Game Boy, of course, you're lining up pills and viruses in similar shades of gray. Color turns out to be a crippling weakness in this version of Dr. Mario, and not just for the reasons you'd expect. But we'll get to that. Dr. Mario's game design never really rises to the level that you'd expect from a work developed by some of Nintendo's top creators of the 8-bit era, but it holds a certain degree of interest nevertheless thanks to the circumstances of its release. Namely, it's the first time we've ever seen a simultaneous NES and Game Boy release. Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle hit Game Boy a few months after the NES version, and Borai Fighter's 2 versions leapfrogged one another depending on the region in question. Here with Dr. Mario, though, we have the first ever, day and date, simultaneous release on the 2 platforms. By default, that also quite likely makes it the first game ever to debut simultaneously on a console and portable system. After all, as of July 1990, the only 2 portables in the running were Game Boy and Lynx. And unless Paperboy debuted on both portables at the same time, which seems unlikely since they were published by different companies, there hadn't been any actual opportunities for a simultaneous Link release with any other game. So there's that. To be fair, Dr. Mario's cross-platform debut was simultaneous strictly in Japan, where it arrived on both Game Boy and Famicom on July 27, 1990. For whatever reason, the game showed up on NES first in the US, and on Game Boy first in Europe. But we can put that down to Nintendo localizations still having been a bit scrambled at that point. Not that Dr. Mario required a lot of localization, it's a simple puzzler with barely any text. And both NES and Game Boy versions turned out to be almost completely identical, barring changes in resolution and color. Of all the games to see a simultaneous cross-platform debut, Dr. Mario probably makes the most sense. Its design is the definition of simplicity, a sort of watered-down Tetris derivative, and we all know how well Tetris did on Game Boy. This is no Tetris though. Where that game offered a perfect balance of simplicity, complexity, strategy, and reaction, Dr. Mario lacks those qualities. Where Tetris presented players with 4-block pieces in 7 different shapes, Dr. Mario consists of 2-block pieces in a single shape with 6 different color variations. Each half of a piece can appear in one of the 3 puzzle colors, resulting in 3 solid color pieces and 3 mixed color pieces. There's just not enough to this design to offer the same substance as in Tetris. Blocks fall, you rotate them and stack them, and once you match 4 blocks of the same color, whether pill or virus, those blocks vanish. The closest thing to complexity in Dr. Mario comes in the way the 2 halves of pills can become detached from one another. The game looks for matches per block, that is, per half capsule of a pill, so you don't need to match entire pills. When you create a match 4 connection, only the matching blocks vanish. If those blocks are part of pills whose other portions don't belong to a match, the matched elements vanish, and the loose pill halves remain on screen, pulled down by gravity to fall and subside on whatever surface lies below. This half-vanishing act opens the door for chain combinations, which are the key to high scores in Dr. Mario, and really the only advanced game mechanic it offers. If loose pill halves fall and create another match 4 connection in the process, you'll earn huge bonus points. A truly great chain of 3 or 4 consecutive matches is worth a ton of points. Otherwise though, there's not really much to Dr. Mario. These simple rules just don't have the strength to support high-level addiction the way Tetris does. It doesn't help that Dr. Mario features some annoying design decisions. In a recently translated Super Mario Kart interview from 1992, which you can read at shmuplations.com, Hideki Kono made a comment implying that game's tendency of altering power-ups you acquire based on your pole position came from Dr. Mario. And indeed, Dr. Mario does seem to give you tons of useless pill pieces as you close in on success. This doesn't raise the game's tension, however, it simply serves to drag out a level by wasting the player's time, helping to further erode any sense of Tetris-like urgency that you might experience from the game. So far in Game Boy, we've seen a ton of puzzlers, as we all well know and sigh about regretfully. However, Tetris-like puzzlers, which involve clearing a stream of randomized matching objects as opposed to solving more concrete and deliberately designed puzzles, have been surprisingly rare. Besides Tetris, there's really only been Flipple. Dr. Mario will be followed in short order by Puzznic though, so perhaps the tide is beginning to turn. Though Bejeweled is still a good decade away, so don't expect a flood of games like this. Anyway, while Dr. Mario's creation was likely inspired by the stunning success of Tetris, it seems more directly inspired in terms of design by columns. In both games, players aim to create rows of objects sharing the same colors. Where Dr. Mario required 4 matching objects, columns paved the way for modern Match 3 games by requiring 1 fewer object per link. It also featured a much greater variety of colored objects than Dr. Mario, and it allowed for diagonal matches, making for a more engrossing and complex game. While most people associate Columns with Sega, and indeed Columns would go on to be a launch title for Sega's own handheld, Game Gear, which would debut in October 1990, it debuted originally in 1989 on a number of personal computer systems, courtesy of its original creator, Jay Gearston. Gearston simply sold the rights to Columns to Sega, who made it a trademark of their platforms, including the arcade. So even though Columns and Dr. Mario debuted on consoles within half a month of one another, the concept for Columns was out in the open well before Dr. Mario showed up. But then again, who even knows if Nintendo was aware at all of European game releases? It's entirely possible the whole thing was simply a coincidence. In any case, Dr. Mario makes for a decent time waster, but it's nowhere near the classic that Tetris had been. If anything, the game probably owes its success in large part to its incredible soundtrack. Hirokazu Tanaka only wrote a handful of tunes for Dr. Mario, but each one is an absolute scorcher, some of his best compositions ever. As in Bulletproof's rendition of Tetris, you can choose from 2 different musical themes as you play. Dubbed Fever and Chill, they're absolute earworms, one upbeat and jazzy, the other down-tempo and intense. Even if the core mechanics of Dr. Mario are only so-so, Tanaka's incredible compositions match beautifully with the game and go a long way toward keeping the game addictive. The steady beat and spacey arpeggios of Chill in particular amount to pure video game jam perfection, and it's hard to put down any game when you have that groove looping in the background. Anyway, yeah, it's yet another puzzle game on Game Boy. But it's a different kind of puzzler, and it has great music, so it's better than average. There is one terrible flaw in Game Boy Dr. Mario though, and that has to do with color. Obviously Game Boy has no color, so you're matching shades of gray. This makes play a little more difficult than on NES, where you could rely on peripheral vision to give a sense of the layout of the board at a glance based on color, something far more difficult to do when you're dealing with monochrome. But for some weird reason, whoever headed up Dr. Mario's graphic design for its portable conversion decided it would be a good idea to make use of all 4 of the system's shades of gray for pieces, even though there are only 3 colors at play. What this means in practice is that 2 of the pills appear in gray shades that perfectly correspond to the gray of their target viruses. The 3rd pill, however, is 1 shade off from its virus. Blue pills and viruses appear as black, and yellow pills and viruses appear as white. But the red pills and red viruses are rendered in 2 different in-between shades, and it makes for an awkward experience. This is especially true if you play by way of a system capable of colorizing Game Boy graphics, such as Game Boy Color or Super Game Boy. Their color palettes have a tendency to draw those gray objects in different colors from one another. Even the Super Game Boy's game-specific preset, which Nintendo programmed into the device for all first-party legacy Game Boy releases, doesn't quite get it right. This one strange design choice makes Game Boy the worst possible platform for playing Dr. Mario. Sure, you can train yourself to see the color discrepancy correctly, but why should you have to? This is Dr. Mario. It's a simple puzzler, and it's meant to be intuitive. Thankfully, you should never really have to play Game Boy Dr. Mario. Nintendo has made the NES version and a number of remakes available on pretty much every platform it's ever produced, and all of them are less compromised than this port. So, if you have to pick a Game Boy puzzler to play, stick with Tetris. Next on Game Boy World,